The gatekeeper's mistake. The air inside JFK International Airport, Gate A-17, was thick with impatience. Exhausted travelers clutched their boarding passes, checking the time on their phones as murmurs of frustration spread through the crowd. The steady stream of announcements overhead did little to soothe the simmering tension. Captain Naomi Carter rolled her shoulders back and adjusted her grip on her flight bag, mentally preparing herself for another long-haul flight. The familiar weight of her airline-issued cap sat firmly atop her neatly styled bun, the embroidered Atlantic Skies Airlines logo resting just above the brim. Today's flight, Flight 762 to Los Angeles, was routine, yet something in the air felt different. As Naomi approached the boarding gate, she instinctively braced herself. She'd been a commercial airline pilot for over a decade, but even now, her mere presence in a pilot's uniform sometimes drew lingering stares, as if passengers were still trying to process the idea that a black woman could command a commercial airliner. She exhaled softly. She was used to it. But that didn't mean it didn't sting. The encounter at the gate. The gate agent, a young woman with chestnut-brown hair pulled into a tight ponytail, barely glanced up from her screen when Naomi approached. "Ma'am, we're not boarding passengers yet," the agent said in a polite but dismissive tone, tapping at her computer. Naomi lifted an eyebrow, momentarily amused. "That's fine," she said smoothly, pulling out her airline badge. "I'm not a passenger. I'm the pilot." The agent's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Her eyes flicked up, taking in Naomi's navy blue uniform, the crisp gold stripes on her sleeves, the airline-issued badge. Yet, there was still hesitation. "Oh," the agent said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I see. Are you with the flight crew?" Several nearby passengers, including a businessman in a tailored suit and a teenage girl scrolling through her phone, glanced up at the interaction. "I am the flight crew," Naomi corrected, her voice steady. "More specifically, I am the captain of this flight." A flicker of surprise crossed the agent's face, but it quickly vanished beneath another forced smile. "Right. Well, I just need to verify something." Before Naomi could respond, a deep, authoritative voice cut through the air like a blade. "Let the real pilots through first," a man's voice said from behind her. Naomi's jaw tightened. The owner of the voice stepped forward, a man in a navy blue tailored suit, salt and pepper hair neatly combed, and an air of self-importance clinging to him like expensive cologne. His silver name tag gleamed under the fluorescent lighting, Thomas Greer, Vice President of Aviation Standards. She recognized the name immediately. Greer had been with Atlantic Skies Airlines for nearly 30 years, rising through the ranks, but he was also known for being staunchly old school. Naomi turned to face him, keeping her posture firm and unwavering. "Mr. Greer," she acknowledged coolly. His gaze flicked over her uniform before returning to the gate agent. "We don't have time for misunderstandings," he said. "Please allow the pilots to board before we worry about," he gestured vaguely at Naomi, "other personnel." The gate agent hesitated, clearly caught between authority and protocol. Passengers began whispering. A young boy sitting nearby nudged his mother. "She's the captain," he whispered, eyes wide. Naomi clenched her teeth, but her voice remained measured. "Mr. Greer," she repeated, "I am the captain of Flight 762. Greer's lips pressed into a thin line. "Captain James Whitman is the listed senior pilot for this flight." Naomi's stomach dropped. Whitman. She hadn't heard that name in over a decade, but she'd never forgotten it. He had been one of her flight instructors back in aviation school, and one of the first people to tell her she would never make it as a commercial pilot. Her fingers curled slightly at the memory. She adjusted her stance. "There's been a reassignment," she said firmly. "Captain Whitman was reassigned 2 days ago. I'm leading this flight." Greer's eyes narrowed. Before he could argue, the click of the cockpit door unlocking echoed through the terminal. A tall figure stepped out, First Officer Jason Patel, her co-pilot for today's flight. His uniform was just as crisp as Naomi's, his dark brown eyes sharp as they scanned the tension-filled scene. His voice rang out clearly. "Captain Carter, pre-flight checks are complete. We're ready for you." A stunned silence settled over the terminal. Passengers turned, eyes widening as the realization hit. Naomi held Greer's gaze. She could practically hear the wheels turning in his head as he tried to formulate a response. But before he could, a slow ripple of applause started from a group of passengers. A man in his late 60s, wearing a veteran's cap, clapped his hands together and gave Naomi a small nod of respect. "About damn time," someone muttered. Naomi turned without another word and stepped toward the jet bridge. She had a flight to command. What lies beneath? Inside the cockpit, Jason Patel exhaled sharply. "That was intense," he said, securing his headset. "Greer's always been an ass, but that was next level." Naomi settled into her captain's chair, the weight of the moment pressing on her shoulders. "He wasn't just challenging me," she said thoughtfully. "He mentioned Whitman." Jason frowned. "What about him?" Naomi tapped at the screen, bringing up the flight's fuel calculations. Her stomach dropped. Something was wrong. The numbers didn't match the pre-approved calculations from maintenance. There was less fuel allocated than what was required for the flight. She glanced at the digital log. The last recorded adjustment had been made by D. Greer. Naomi's pulse quickened. "Jason," she said, her voice suddenly sharp, "get maintenance control on the line. Now." Jason immediately reached for the radio. This wasn't just about prejudice anymore. Something much bigger was happening. And if she didn't act fast, hundreds of lives could be in danger. A dangerous discovery. Inside the cockpit of Flight 762, Captain Naomi Carter kept her expression neutral, but inside, her mind raced. The numbers in front of her didn't lie. The fuel allocation for their flight was dangerously off, lower than required for a standard JFK to LAX route. And the last person to adjust the calculations? D. Greer. Her eyes flicked to First Officer Jason Patel, who was already on the radio with maintenance control. His fingers drummed lightly on the panel as he waited for a response. Naomi took a slow breath. This wasn't just a logistical error. Something about this felt deliberate. And if she hadn't checked the numbers herself, they would have taken off without enough fuel to reach Los Angeles. She tightened her grip on the control panel, swallowing the rising unease in her chest. "Maintenance control, this is First Officer Patel from Flight 762, Jason said into his headset, his voice steady but urgent. "We're noticing a discrepancy in the fuel levels. Can you confirm our latest fuel load?" A brief silence crackled through the radio before a voice responded. "Stand by, 762. We're checking now." Naomi exchanged a glance with Jason. That was not a normal response. Usually, maintenance would immediately confirm the fuel levels. The hesitation only confirmed what she already feared: something was very, very wrong. An unsettling pattern. As they waited, Naomi pulled up the airline's internal flight records on her tablet. She began scanning past flights assigned to Captain James Whitman, the very pilot Thomas Greer had expected to be on this flight today. And what she found made her blood run cold. Over the past 6 months, 3 separate flights piloted by Whitman had made emergency landings due to fuel miscalculations. One at Denver International. One at Chicago O'Hare. One at San Francisco International. Each time, the pilots had barely managed to land safely. Each time, the reports had been written off as administrative miscalculations. Naomi gritted her teeth. There was nothing accidental about this. Someone, likely Greer or someone in his circle, had been deliberately tampering with flights. And now, Whitman had been quietly removed from Flight 762's schedule at the last minute. Naomi had unknowingly stepped into his place. And now, her flight had been sabotaged, too. The hidden sabotage. Jason was still on the radio when maintenance control finally responded. Flight 762, we have reviewed the logs. We confirm that your fuel allocation was adjusted this morning at 5:32 a.m. Naomi glanced at the clock. That was right before she had arrived at the airport. Who authorized that change? Jason asked, his voice sharp. A hesitation. Then. The request came from, Operations Management. Signed by, D. Greer. Jason swore under his breath. Naomi's stomach twisted. Greer. He had tried to have Whitman fly this route. Had Whitman known about this? Had he been in on it? Or had Greer pulled Naomi into this flight because he expected her to fail? She knew what would have happened if she hadn't caught the discrepancy. Midway over the Midwest, their fuel would have run dangerously low. They would have been forced into an emergency landing, likely in an unfamiliar or unsafe location. Passengers would have panicked. And Naomi, a black female captain, would have taken the blame. The headlines would have read, Pilot error forces emergency landing, inexperienced captain to blame. And just like that, her career would have been destroyed. A silent betrayal. Naomi set her jaw. She refused to be another statistic. She turned back to the radio, her voice sharp and professional. Maintenance, override that order and load the proper fuel allocation immediately. There was a pause. Then, finally, understood, Captain. We'll correct the error. Naomi nodded at Jason, who gave her a tight-lipped, knowing look. This wasn't over. Confronting the enemy. 30 minutes later, Naomi left the cockpit and stepped back into the jet bridge, where a familiar figure stood, speaking into his phone. Thomas Greer. When he saw her, his expression barely changed. Captain Carter, he said smoothly, tucking his phone away. Is there a problem? Naomi didn't bother with pleasantries. You tampered with my flight, she said, her voice low but steady. For the first time, Greer's lips twitched into something resembling amusement. Tampered, he echoed, feigning ignorance. Captain, you must be mistaken. The operations team handles fuel adjustments all the time. 3 flights. 3 emergency landings. All under Captain Whitman. She stepped forward, lowering her voice. I was never supposed to catch it, was I? His eyes flickered with something dangerous. I have no idea what you're insinuating, he said smoothly. Naomi clenched her jaw. She had no proof. Not yet. But she knew what was happening. And she had a flight to command. With a sharp exhale, she turned back toward the cockpit. Greer's voice followed her. I'd be careful, Captain Carter, he said softly. You wouldn't want to make any unnecessary mistakes up there. She froze. That was a threat. But she didn't turn back. Instead, she walked straight into the cockpit, slid into her seat, and prepared for takeoff. The storm ahead. As Naomi pushed the throttles forward, sending the aircraft soaring into the sky, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Something bigger was happening inside Atlantic Skies Airlines. And the real battle had just begun. The descent into truth. The sky stretched endlessly in every direction, a deep blue canvas speckled with wispy clouds. Flight 762 cruised at 35,000 feet, but Captain Naomi Carter couldn't shake the unease that settled in her stomach. Something was wrong. She had always loved the solitude of the cockpit. Up here, the expectations, the biases, and the corporate politics fell away. The only thing that mattered was skill, precision, and control. But today, the cockpit felt different. Today, it felt like a trap. She stole a glance at First Officer Jason Patel, who was scanning the fuel gauges for the third time since takeoff. The numbers were steady now, thanks to their intervention. Still, he hadn't spoken much since they left the ground. He was thinking the same thing she was. Greer had tried to sabotage them. And they had no idea what else might be waiting for them. Anomalies in the system. Naomi adjusted her headset and opened the communication channel. Flight 762 to LAX Tower, confirm current wind speeds and conditions at destination. A crackling pause. Then. 762, LAX Tower here. Winds at 10 knots from the west, clear conditions expected upon arrival. Normal. Routine. Still, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that something about this flight wasn't routine at all. You good? Jason finally asked, breaking the silence. Naomi exhaled, her fingers tightening around the yoke. Not even close. Jason chuckled dryly, but there was no humor in it. Yeah. Me neither. Naomi reached for her tablet, pulling up the flight's diagnostics. Everything looked fine. Too fine. She scrolled through the logs, looking for any abnormalities in the system. And that's when she saw it. A small but critical adjustment had been logged mid-flight. Someone, from the ground, had altered the navigation system. A quiet, deadly sabotage. Naomi's heart pounded as she ran her fingers over the screen, checking the details. The original flight path had been slightly altered, by just a few degrees. Not enough for the crew to notice. But enough to push them into the wrong airspace. Naomi's pulse hammered. This was no accident. Someone was trying to force them into restricted airspace, a maneuver that could get them intercepted by military jets. Or worse, marked as a rogue aircraft. She turned sharply to Jason. Check the navigation route. Now. Jason frowned but obeyed, quickly pulling up the display. A second later, his jaw tightened. Shit. Naomi immediately corrected course, switching back to the original trajectory. If they hadn't caught that adjustment in time. If they had drifted even a little further off course. They could have been labeled as hostile. They could have been shot down. The ghost in the system. Naomi steadied her breathing. This wasn't just corporate politics. This was a targeted attack. Someone inside Atlantic skies was deliberately trying to take this flight down. Her hands tightened into fists. She wasn't about to let that happen. Who the hell has remote access to our navigation system? Jason asked, voice tight with anger. Naomi's mind raced. There were only a few high-level personnel with that kind of access. She thought of Greer. Of Whitman. And then, she thought of a name she hadn't considered before. The man in the shadows. Captain James Whitman. He was supposed to be on this flight. But at the last minute, he had been removed from the schedule. Had he known? Had he been part of this? Or had he been the real target? Naomi's chest tightened as she considered the possibility. Had they tried to take out Whitman? And when she took his place, had they simply continued with their plan, assuming she wouldn't notice? Jason exhaled sharply. We need to report this. Naomi nodded. Not yet. Jason shot her a look. What? Naomi's voice was firm. If we report it now, whoever's behind this will cover their tracks before we land. Jason clenched his jaw but nodded. He understood. They needed proof. A silent war. Naomi knew that when they landed, this wouldn't just be about one flight. This was bigger. There was something corrupt running deep within Atlantic Skies Airlines. And whoever was behind it was willing to kill to keep it hidden. As the engines hummed beneath her, Naomi Carter made a silent vow. They would land this plane safely. They would expose the truth. And no matter who was responsible. She was going to bring them down. Turbulence in the shadows. The hum of the engines filled the cockpit, steady and rhythmic, but Captain Naomi Carter felt anything but steady. She and First Officer Jason Patel had just discovered a deliberate attempt to sabotage Flight 762, a remote adjustment in their navigation system, nudging them toward restricted airspace. If they hadn't caught it in time, they could have been intercepted, or worse, marked as a hostile aircraft. Someone at Atlantic Skies Airlines wanted this plane to go down. And they weren't done yet. A dangerous game. Naomi's fingers tightened around the yoke as she took a deep breath, keeping her expression neutral. No sudden movements. No panic. If whoever was behind this was still watching, she couldn't let them know she had figured it out. Jason glanced at her, his dark eyes sharp. "What's the play, Cap?" She exhaled slowly. "We land this plane. We don't let them know we're onto them." Jason's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "You think they're still messing with us?" Naomi didn't answer immediately. She knew they were. Whoever was behind this had been careful, subtle changes, precise sabotage. This wasn't a reckless attack. This was someone inside the system. Someone who knew exactly how to make it look like a technical failure. Or pilot error. Naomi's stomach turned. If anything happened to this plane, the official report would blame her. A black woman captain. The first in the airline's history. They would say she panicked. That she wasn't competent enough. They would erase the truth. Not on her watch. Echoes of the past. The weight of what was happening pressed against Naomi's chest. She thought about Captain James Whitman, the senior pilot who was supposed to be on this flight. He had been mysteriously removed from the roster at the last minute. Had he known? Had he been the real target? Or had they simply gone through with their plan anyway, assuming she wouldn't notice? The thought made Naomi's blood run cold. It wasn't just about her career anymore. They were willing to risk the lives of 232 passengers. For what? She intended to find out. The phantom glitch. A sudden, sharp beep cut through the cockpit. Jason frowned and glanced at the systems panel. Autopilot just disengaged. Naomi's stomach clenched. She hadn't touched it. Jason hadn't touched it. And autopilot didn't just disengage on its own. A creeping sense of dread slithered up her spine. She reached for the controls and re-engaged it manually. The system responded, but Naomi didn't relax. She and Jason exchanged a look. They were being watched. A race against time. Naomi's hands were steady on the yoke as she checked their altitude. 30,000 feet. They still had time before the descent. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized, they might not make it to LAX. Whoever was interfering with their systems had access to everything. Navigation. Fuel readings. Autopilot. If they could alter the flight path remotely, they could do far worse. "Jason," she said carefully. "Pull up manual controls." He frowned but obeyed, flipping a few switches on the control panel. If the automated systems were compromised, they needed a backup plan. Naomi had no doubt they were flying into a trap. The question was, how deep did the conspiracy go? The whisper on the radio. As she focused on keeping the plane steady, the radio crackled to life. A voice, low, urgent. "Flight 762, you are not safe. Repeat, you are not safe." Naomi's pulse spiked. Jason's head snapped toward the radio. Who the hell? Another crackle. The voice was distorted, but Naomi could still make out the next words. "Watch your descent." Then, silence. Naomi and Jason stared at the radio in stunned silence. That wasn't air traffic control. That wasn't an official transmission. Someone was warning them. Jason let out a shaky breath. "Okay, I'm officially freaking out." Naomi didn't answer. She was too busy staring at the altitude readings. She hadn't started their descent yet. But the numbers were dropping. The plane was already going down. Someone was overriding the altitude controls. And if they didn't take back control soon, they were going to crash. A captain's resolve. Naomi acted instantly. Taking manual control now, she barked, flipping a series of switches. Jason followed her lead, his fingers flying across the controls. Systems not responding. The plane shuddered. Passengers in the cabin screamed as turbulence rattled the aircraft. The altitude gauge plummeted. 28,000 feet. 27,000 feet. They were losing altitude too fast. Naomi's mind raced. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to cause a problem. They wanted this plane to go down. And if she didn't do something, it would. She forced herself to focus. Panic was the enemy. Backup power to manual override. Now, she commanded. Jason ripped open the emergency panel, flipping a switch that cut off all remote system access. The plane jerked violently. For a terrifying second, Naomi thought they had lost control completely. Then, the yoke responded. She had it. Naomi pulled back hard, fighting against the momentum dragging them down. 25,000 feet. 24,500 feet. The engines roared as the plane steadied. Naomi gritted her teeth and climbed. 26,000 feet. 27,000 feet. They were back on course. The cockpit was silent except for the heavy breathing between her and Jason. They had survived, for now. But Naomi wasn't done. Her eyes burned with fury as she gripped the yoke. Whoever had tried to bring this plane down had just made a huge mistake. Because now, she was coming for them. The descent into deception. 30,000 feet above the truth. The air in the cockpit was thick with tension. The plane was back under control, for now. Captain Naomi Carter's grip on the yoke was firm, her heartbeat pounding like a war drum in her ears. Whoever had hijacked their systems had full remote access to the aircraft. That wasn't a simple hack. This was an inside job. And whoever was behind it was still watching. She could almost feel their eyes tracking her every move. But they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated her. Jason's discovery. First Officer Jason Patel was still running diagnostics on the flight computer. His fingers flew over the keypad as he muttered under his breath. "Okay, so this isn't just a software malfunction," he said, his voice low but urgent. "This is a direct override from an external source. Someone is literally trying to fly this plane from the ground." Naomi's jaw clenched. "Where's the breach?" Jason tapped a few more buttons. "It's coming from Atlantic Sky's private network." A cold chill ran down Naomi's spine. Her airline. Her own company. She gritted her teeth. "Can you block them out?" Jason let out a humorless laugh. "Whoever did this has some serious clearance. If I shut them out, they'll know we're onto them." Naomi cursed under her breath. If they acted too soon, their enemy might try something even worse. They had to play this smart. A message from the shadows. Suddenly, the radio crackled again. That same distorted voice. "You don't have much time." Naomi's breath caught. "Who are you?" Static. Then. "Check the cargo hold." And just like that, the signal cut out. Naomi and Jason stared at each other. "Cargo hold?" Jason was the first to speak. "There's no way they mean." Ding. A soft chime sounded over the intercom. It was from the flight attendants. Jason reached for the switch. "Flight deck here. What's going on?" A nervous voice came through. "Captain, we heard something in the lower deck." Like, banging. From inside the cargo hold. Naomi's blood ran cold. They weren't alone on this plane. Danger below deck. The cargo hold was supposed to be empty, aside from checked luggage and freight. But if someone had hidden down there. They weren't a stowaway. They were part of the plan. Naomi took a deep breath. She turned to Jason. You keep us steady. I'm going down there. Jason's eyes widened. Are you insane? What if they're armed? Naomi didn't answer. She was already undoing her harness. A captain's gamble. Naomi moved swiftly through the aircraft, keeping her expression neutral as she passed through the first-class cabin. Passengers were oblivious. They had no idea that just minutes ago, their flight had been on the verge of being remotely hijacked. That someone had tried to kill them. And now, whoever was in the cargo hold, they were the missing piece. A flight attendant, Mira Jones, stood near the hatch leading below deck. Her hands were trembling. Captain, I don't know what's down there, but it's not normal. Naomi gave her a reassuring nod. Stay here. If anything happens, alert Jason in the cockpit. With that, she turned and opened the hatch. A shadow in the dark. The cargo hold was cold and dimly lit. Naomi climbed down the ladder cautiously, her breath slow and measured. She scanned the area. Rows of suitcases. Shipping containers. Then. A figure. Half hidden behind a stack of storage crates. Naomi's pulse spiked. She took a step closer. I know you're there. Silence. Then, a slow movement. A man stepped out from the shadows. And Naomi's entire body tensed. The ghost from the past. He was tall and broad-shouldered. But it wasn't his size that made her freeze. It was his face. She knew him. Elliot Graves. A former Atlantic Skies executive. Fired years ago after a federal investigation into airline safety violations. And yet. He was here. On her plane. The truth takes flight. Elliot smirked. Didn't think I'd see you again, Captain Carter. Naomi's heart pounded, but she kept her face unreadable. What the hell are you doing here? He tilted his head. Just making sure my plan goes smoothly. A slow dread crept up Naomi's spine. You're behind this. Elliot chuckled. Oh, not just me. I'm just the messenger. The real masterminds? He let out a mocking whistle. They're a little higher up the food chain. Naomi's fists clenched. What's the endgame, Graves? He sighed dramatically. Atlantic Skies is rotten, Captain. Has been for years. You think you're making history as the airline's first black female captain? Please. You're just a tool. A distraction while they pull the strings behind the scenes. Naomi's stomach twisted. What are they planning? Elliot's smirk widened. Oh, you'll find out soon enough. And then. He lunged. A fight for control. Naomi barely dodged the first blow. Elliot was fast, but she was faster. She twisted, slamming her elbow into his ribs. He grunted but didn't back down. He swung again, aiming for her throat. Naomi ducked, grabbing the nearest metal tool case and slamming it into his shoulder. Elliot stumbled back, cursing. Damn, Carter. Didn't take you for a fighter. Naomi's chest rose and fell. You don't know me. Elliot's expression darkened. No, but I know how this ends. Then. He reached into his jacket. And Naomi saw the glint of a knife. The final move. She had seconds to react. Naomi grabbed a nearby emergency oxygen tank. And swung it with all her strength. The metal slammed into Elliot's wrist. The knife clattered to the floor. Naomi didn't hesitate. She rammed her shoulder into his chest, knocking him backward into a stack of crates. He collapsed. Unconscious. Naomi's breath came in heavy gasps. She grabbed the plane's emergency handcuffs from a storage panel and locked his wrists. Then, without wasting another second, she reached for the cockpit intercom. Jason. We have a situation. Graves is in custody, but there's more. This goes all the way to the top. A beat of silence. Then Jason's voice, low and tense. Cap, we have another problem. Naomi's stomach clenched. What is it? Jason exhaled sharply. Air traffic control just told us we've been rerouted to an unauthorized landing zone.